Hey, Chris Ferdinandi here. Today's Vanilla.js quick tip is an excerpt from my course and book on native web components, which you can learn more about over at vanillajsguides.com. All right, let's dig into it. Web components are a set of browser APIs that you can use to create your own custom HTML elements. Web components can include their own built-in styles and interactivity, and are protected from naming collisions or unintended interactions with other code. For example, let's say you wanted to include a loading icon component in your web app. You would create a loading icon web component and include it in your HTML as a custom element, like I have here with the loading icon element. You would also load a JavaScript file that defines the element itself, its styles, and its functionality. Behind the scenes, the loading icon element gets rendered into the UI as a collection of style div elements, an ARIA Live region that displays the current loading status, and some built-in styles to make the spinner actually spin. When the content is loaded, you can add a loaded attribute to the loading icon element. So for example, here, I'm grabbing this element and I'm adding an attribute to it. And in doing so, the component will automatically remove the spinner and make an announcement for screen readers. So the authoring experience with a web component becomes a lot simpler. You don't need web components to create a loading icon, or any component for that matter. So why use them? First, they make it a lot more obvious what a component in your UI actually is. An element called loading icon is a lot more obvious than a set of empty nested div elements with a loading ring class on it. And in this example, where we've got the ARIA Live region before it to announce the content loading status, depending on how this is rendered into the HTML or coded in there, it might not even seem as though it's connected to the loading ring at all, which can create its own set of confusion. If you're working with a team of developers or creating a design system, web components provide a handful of additional benefits as well. First, because the web component generates all of the behind-the-scenes HTML, you don't need to worry about developers forgetting something important. For example, here, this should say loading ring, and it says loading rings with an S, so this isn't going to render the icon at all. This example is missing one of the 4 nested divs, which is pretty easy to do, and will result in a loading icon that doesn't look right. It's going to be missing a chunk of it. It's going to animate weirdly. If you fix a bug or update your component, you also don't have to manually update a bunch of HTML everywhere the component is used. You only need to update the JavaScript. For example, imagine if the original version of your loading icon component did not include an ARIA Live region to announce when the content was loaded to screen readers. You realize the mistake and you update your component. With a traditional HTML component, any developer who uses it will need to update their HTML, JavaScript, and CSS files to include the fix. With web components, they only have to update the JavaScript file. So here we're using loading icon v2. Everything else, no changes needed. We just keep the loading icon component in the HTML, and everything else is taken care of. With web components, the CSS, JavaScript, and behind-the-scenes HTML are all scoped and encapsulated. This avoids one of the most common problems in team environments, naming collisions and unintended interactions. If, for example, a developer already had a component with the loading ring class on it and the styles to go along with it, this CSS here would potentially break the loading icon component if it was implemented using plain old HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But with web components, the styles in your component only apply to the component's HTML, and those elements aren't affected by outside styles. We'll learn more about how that all works in another lesson. But to summarize quickly, the benefits of web components include clarity and readability, a simpler and less error-prone developer experience, ease of updating components, and scoping and encapsulation. If you like this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and maybe even share it with someone else who you think might enjoy it. You can also get my daily developer tips newsletter over at gomakethings.com, where every weekday I share a new tip, trick, tool, or Vanilla.js snippet to help you build a simpler and more resilient web. Thanks so much for watching.